Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your weekly podcast for all your tillage news and advice. In this episode, I'll be discussing potato production with Denis Griffin, a potato breeder in Teagasc Oak Park. I first asked Denis, how is potato growth progressing and is weather impacting the crop?
In general, I think crops are looking very well. They're emerging incredibly fast. Soil temperatures are very, very high at the moment, and I've seen some potatoes that had chits on them that have broken the ground in less than 3 weeks. And some of the material I saw, some of the crops that were planted in late March and early April are actually even at tuber initiation at the moment. The very dry conditions have given us excellent seed beds, but I mean, a few of the problems that we might be encountering now at the moment are, if people didn't get rain and herbicides were applied in very dry conditions, they might struggle with residual weed control. And also we're coming up on a need for irrigation at the moment, particularly in crops which are coming up to tuber initiation. Although looking at some crops in the Carlow area on heavier ground over the last couple of days, there was quite a bit of moisture still in the ground. And I suppose the other issue we've had over the last few days is we had a very severe frost about 2 weeks ago, which would have affected many of the early sown crops and early potatoes, early varieties as well.
Yeah, I've seen that frost down this part of the world, Denis. Is that likely to affect the crops in the near future?
I'd say for most main crop varieties like rooster that were planted in late March and early April, I looked at a few crops last night that had been severely affected initially with the frost, and they had just broken ground, and you wouldn't know that they had received frost damage at all at this stage. They've recovered remarkably well, and a lot of the frost damaged tissue has disappeared and new foliage has come out. In fact, in some cases, it's maybe evened the crops up a little bit in terms of emergence. I suppose there's a big difference though in terms of physiological shocks for a crop that receives them before tuber initiation and after tuber initiation. So I would say with most of those crops that were planted in April and or late March and early April, that'll have very, very little effect. I'd be more concerned for crops like very well established crops of British Queen that might have had significant foliage on and significant tubers under them. If they suffered a lot of foliage damage, it'll cause a check in growth, which could cause, internal problems in the tubers or perhaps secondary growth as well. When that foliage tries to recover and start growing again, there will be a check in growth. And I think, once you have tubers set, physiological shock can cause a bigger problem. And I believe the frost was that severe that, even in coastal areas, there was some frost also.
And for those earlier sown ones, Denis, is there anything that somebody can do, if it got that kind of a shock?
I don't believe there is, to be honest with you. Because it's largely a damage to the foliage that is there, and the foliage will have to recover and begin to feed the tubers again. And I suppose it depends on how badly. If the top 2 or 3 inches maybe were burned off the foliage, it mightn't be so bad. If it was significantly burnt down, it's going to take a little bit of time to recover. And I don't think that additional fertilizer or anything like that is going to happen, is going to help dramatically either. Most of those crops would have been physiologically aged, so there's a limit to how long they will grow for. I think it's just a case of wait and see.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier, and maybe this might work into it a little bit, you mentioned earlier a lot of dry ground and maybe people talking about irrigation. Is it necessary to irrigate the ones we were talking about earlier, or maybe potatoes in general where ground is a bit dry?
Well, I think, 2018 taught us a lot of things, and I was very surprised at how resilient potato crops that weren't irrigated were in 2018, particularly on heavy ground. We irrigate in Ireland for 2 reasons. One is for scab control and the other is for yield. And at the moment, we're very, very much looking at scab control. And the old rule of thumb was that you wanted to put on 1/2 inch or 12.5 mils a week for 6 weeks following tuber initiation. Now, many crops that were sown in March and early April are at or beyond the hook stage or even at tuber swelling stage at this stage and will need irrigation. But what I think growers should do is plan their irrigation very, very close or very, very well at the moment. There's evidence there to say that irregular watering, if you're not able to supply that water every week, that irregular or poor applications of irrigation can actually exacerbate scab, where you get a wetting and drying effect. So I would be inclined to suggest to people, a lot of growers, they know their ground. If they have heavy land where the pH is low, or similar land that they had in 2018 that wasn't irrigated, where there wasn't a scab problem, maybe set that aside and focus on whatever ground that you irrigate for the next 6 or 8 weeks, for scab control, to be able to get around and water that regularly and maintain it and get a pristine crop. But if you overstretch, I think that irregular watering may cause more problems than it solves.
Okay, so but it's not just necessarily about scab control. There's also in the very dry soils, maybe up around kind of Dublin, that have got very little water. It's also about yield, trying to maintain that as well, is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think tougher soils, a land which is a little bit fresher and maybe a little bit closer to grass will have a better withholding capacity, but land that is out of long-term tillage and a little bit tougher is absolutely going to need water at this stage. Some of the crops, some of the ground I've seen is heavier and it has a little bit of water still in it. But I mean, if you're not able to make a ball, of soil in your fist from the drill, that those crops need water, and absolutely yield is key there at the moment. But it's very much, I think, about looking at your crops and seeing what the ground is like and where it's needed and prioritizing those fields which will respond best to it.
Okay. And where a guy is irrigating and he's kind of wetting the soil and he's wetting the foliage, that brings to mind blight. And is that going to increase the level of or the risk of blight? And is it something that guys should be thinking about, whether they're irrigating or not, to kind of go at it kind of straight away?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at the moment, we're in very, very different situations in different parts of the country. The northwest and the southeast have had more rain than the east of the country, and there's probably more microclimates, and there's been a couple of blight warnings already. Crops that are here in the moment, they haven't reached a rapid canopy development just yet. Depending on how much foliage is present, I think, if there's a risk of blight, you could consider a protectant fungicide to hold it for a week or two. But when crops enter into that rapid canopy development phase and put on a huge amount of leaf area very, very quickly, I think, it's important to look at the weather and determine what sort of a risk of blight there is at the moment. Is there any blight in the area? I think cultural control is very, very important. That rapid canopy development phase that we're coming into now at the moment is incredibly important because it sets the foundation for the entire crop throughout the year. And it's also that very, very rapidly growing tissue is at a very susceptible stage to blight as well. And when you're irrigating, it's changing the microclimate and making the crop a little bit more susceptible, or there's more moisture around. If we do get rain or mist, with the heat that's in the ground at the moment, we could have very, very heavy blight pressure. There's probably not a lot of inoculum around at the moment. But in terms of blight control at the moment, I think guys would want to target some systemic products into that early season blight control, and some of them maybe like Zorvec is one, which is probably the Rolls-Royce treatment at the moment, and I think there's two different formulations of that available, or products with propamacarb like Proxanil. But it's important with a product like that, it's a cheaper alternative for crops and maybe could be used with a little bit, where the pressure is a little bit less, it needs to be used with a protectant fungicide as well.
I suppose we don't have to, over-egg it in the sense of growers know the fact that, blight control is preventative. It's, if you're chasing it, you're probably losing the battle. So guys probably need to start earlier rather than later. And do they still need in these dry conditions to go as regularly every week or every 10 days, or can they stretch it a bit more than that? Or
I think, to be honest with you, it's a case of having a look around. Is there any blight in the area, walking the crops? Is there any tubers which maybe have come through from seed in the last year, which might have a little bit of blight around? Where we have very, very hot days, and like we have at the moment, 22 degrees and no rain, there's very, very little chance of blight spreading. But it's something that you're going to chase before the crops really take off. A spray of Mancozeb or maybe Sherlan will be no harm to hold the crop until using a more expensive systemic when there's sufficient foliage there to take it. And when you move into that phase, if you were using something like Zorvec and the weather is good, you could potentially, I think, push the timing a little bit better.
But again, I suppose the advice is to keep an eye on the weather and keep an eye on your crop. I suppose really is the big thing.
I think, in that rapid host phase, you're setting the foundation for the whole rest of the year. And if you're chasing blight, you're losing. It's like if you're explaining, you're losing. If you're chasing blight, you're losing. I think you need to be on top of it in that period. And if there's any level of blight protection at all, you need to be on a 7-day regime.
Okay, I just want to switch a little bit, Denis, and maybe have a look at seed for a second. The majority of growers, I suppose, out there grow a certain amount of seed for their own use. Is there a limit to the recycling of that seed on farm?
Well, I suppose Ireland is a high-grade seed area, and we're only allowed to grow basic or white label seed here. And one consequence of that is that our seed potatoes tend to be of a higher standard than and shorter generations than in other countries. So for that reason, if you buy certified seed to plant on the farm to save seed off, you can only take one wear crop off of that crop. I suppose if varieties are protected as well, then there is a farm saved seed remuneration which should be paid to the variety owner as well. But in Ireland, only one crop can be taken off a certified seed crop.
Okay, so virus is obviously one of the big, I suppose, factors there in terms of seed potato production and trying to minimize the amount of virus that's there. What are the types of viruses, and what are the most important ones that are out there guys should be looking out for?
Well, I suppose the viruses that we have at the moment have probably changed considerably. Potato virus X and leaf roll were very popular in the past, and we don't see as much of them at all now. And potato virus Y is by far and away the most important, and it's endemic, I suppose, in potato production. And again, the strains have changed dramatically. We used to have a strain called YO, which was quite easy to identify. And when we got a primary infection, the symptoms would be very, very visible very quickly. We have a whole range of strains now, and YO is not very common. There's a range of N strains, new type strains. We have the virus, the tuber necrotic strain, but it doesn't seem to cause symptoms here, possibly because of our cooler soil temperatures and maybe also our variety profile. But there's also a number of new recombinant strains which have come in from Europe. And they can cause yield loss, and they can cause quality issues in terms of tuber shape issues and things like that as well. The one thing I suppose about potato virus Y is it's a non-persistent virus, so it's very, very quickly picked up by aphids and spread from plant to plant. The aphid only has to probe an infected plant and probe an uninfected plant to cause the infection. So insecticides are probably of limited value in terms of controlling them. I think the main use for insecticides in terms of controlling virus is to prevent colonization of a crop and actually just retain the aphid numbers at a low level. Also, some of the insecticides like pyrethroids, they have a knockdown effect, so they can actually zap the aphid before he can cause infection. But I mean, the use of insecticides is probably really only warranted extensively in seed crops. In wear crops, the accumulation of virus is not as important. It can affect yield and quality, but I think IPM standards need to be applied there in terms of watching aphid numbers and walking crops and having an idea to see what it is before you would actually use an insecticide.
The final question, Denis, I just want to ask is around, maybe to follow up to the viruses and that end of it. Where a guy has seed potatoes, even if he's only recycling them for a year, how often should he walk the crops, and or is there a need for walking those crops in combination with his other agronomic controls?
Do you mean now from the point of view of an IPM or from the point of view of actually roguing the crops? I mean, with seed crops, the most important thing to do, the most important thing you can do to maintain the certification or to achieve certification is to reduce the number of infected plants in the crop. And the only way to do that is by roguing. And I think at the moment now is a good time to start roguing crops, because if there are infected plants which have made it through for last year, it's much less work to take out small plants at this time of the year than before an inspection in the middle of July when there's a lot of tubers underneath them. So, I think for seed crops, they need to be rogued a couple of times during the year to ensure that they meet certification standards, not just prior to inspection. But I think it's good practice for guys to be out having a look at their crops, on a weekly basis to see what's happening in the fields and if there are aphids present, or if there's any developing weed issues or bacterial issues.
Exactly, and that obviously comes into looking at the irrigation side of the house, looking at the blight side of the house, and the weeds, as was mentioned earlier on.
Absolutely.
Denis, thanks very much for your time. We're going to come back to you again sometime later in the year, and we'll chat a little bit further about potatoes, breeding maybe, and maybe chips as well later on in the season. Thanks, Denis.
Okay, thanks a million, Michael.
That's it for the Tillage Edge this week, and my thanks to Denis for joining me on the podcast. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more farming news, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.